This is Teachers Talk Radio, and you are listening live.
Hello, good evening, and welcome to the Late Late Show on Thursday, the 12th of October. I'm your host, Paul Hazzard. And with me tonight is Professor Noel Purdy. We'll also be joined by members of his research team. We'll be talking about growing up online. Let's get to it.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and you are listening live. Tune in live at ttradio.org, or to join in the conversation, download the Podbean app and search Teachers Talk Radio. Follow the hashtag TTRadio. Tune in, talk it out with Teachers Talk Radio.
Hello, good evening everybody. Welcome to the show. As you heard in the introduction there, Professor Noel Purdy is with me this evening, and I can see he's in the studio. We'll just check straight away if we're connected properly. Hello Noel, can you hear me?
Good evening, Paul. Can you hear me?
Oh, that's great. Yeah, loud and clear. Yes, yeah, perfect. Excellent. Noel, we're going to start off just with a few messages of the week's news as it is in education, and we'll be back shortly after these messages when we'll be talking about what's really the latest research in children's online lives. Talk to you shortly.
Teaching is a rewarding profession, but it comes with its fair share of challenges. That's where ADAPT come in. We're not your typical trade union, but instead a modern, apolitical alternative, offering expert legal, employment and mental health support. Protection without the politics. So what makes ADAPT different? We're always apolitical and independent, specialised solely in supporting individual teachers. Our caseworkers are professionally qualified, ensuring you always get the best advice. Plus, there's 24/7 mental health support. Whether it's a simple contract check or handling serious allegations, ADAPT are here for you. Join the thousands of educators who've chosen ADAPT to protect their careers. Subscribe at adapt.org.uk today. ADAPT. Supporting school staff. Protecting careers.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and this is Teachers Talk Radio News.
Schools may have to redraw budgets for the next academic year after what the BBC describes as a blunder by the Department for Education. A miscalculation came about because the number of pupils was underestimated. An original plan of a 2.7% increase per pupil in England for the academic year 2024 to 25 has now had to be revised to 1.9%. The government has ordered an inquiry and issued an apology. In a letter to the Education Select Committee, the DFE stressed that this was not a reduction to the total school's budget, but said the amount promised had to be recalculated because an undiscovered error made by DFE officials during initial calculations. The BBC calculated that keeping the original planned increase of 2.7% would have meant the government having to find a further £370 million to top up the overall school's budget. Jeff Barton, General Secretary of the Association of School and College Leaders, said the error was unfortunate and frustrating, and that it was likely that trusts and local authorities will have used the incorrect figures and will now need to revise budgets. A-levels and T-levels will be replaced by a new qualification for school leavers in England, according to new plans announced by PM Rishi Sunak. The plans, reported across media outlets, would see 16 to 19-year-olds study around 5 subjects as part of the so-called Advanced British Standard, including some maths to 18. The plans prompted many to question how this would be delivered, but Mr Sunak said that more teachers would be recruited and that changes would be aimed at pupils who are currently only just starting primary schools. He also announced that the changes would see students spend 195 hours more with a teacher. He also promised an additional £600 million over 2 years to increase training of maths teachers and funding for those studying for compulsory GCSE resits in colleges in maths and English. The plans will go to consultation for possible implementation around 2033 to 34. But with a general election on the horizon, many may feel they are unlikely to happen should there be a change in government. The early years and primary sectors have responded to reports in the Times that children will have to brush their teeth under supervision in schools. According to the paper, Labour is planning to use schools and nurseries to help save NHS dentistry, and that the party would introduce supervised toothbrushing in schools for children aged 3 to 5. And this would be prioritised in areas with the highest incidence of childhood tooth decay. Whilst dental associations and charities welcomed the proposals, Paul Whiteman of the NAHT said the union had serious reservations about how such a policy could even work, and that it is not the role of teachers to make sure children brush their teeth. Schools Week reports on comments made by Amanda Spielman, Chief Inspector of Schools in England, at the Confederation of Schools Trusts annual conference. Ms Spielman was responding to questions about a rise in complaints to Ofsted about schools. In 2017 to 18, there were around 11,500 complaints, but in 2021 to 22, this had risen to almost 15,000. Ms Spielman said that post-COVID people were grumpier and have a greater propensity to put pen to paper, but the complaints leading to early inspection numbers weren't any higher than previously. She said there was no question more complaints were coming through, but that she was sceptical it reflected any real change. In Wales, the BBC reports on an ongoing school-run parking row. Residents of a street in Bridgend say issues at pick-up and drop-off times are persisting 18 months after a protest saw people living in a cul-de-sac blocking the road. They describe the scene outside of a nearby primary school as carnage and claim cars and property have been damaged. Residents have been blocked in their driveways, and this has led to rising tempers. This is a perennial problem across the country for many who live near primary schools. The row in Wales is unlikely to be resolved anytime soon. Finally, student housing has made the news again this week, this time in Salford, where, according to BBC Local News, a major student letting company has been accused of falsifying a tenant's signature on a document to defend a property's filthy conditions. The company is alleged to have added the signature to a waiver saying tenants were aware the property had outstanding maintenance when they moved in, but tenants said they had been told issues would be resolved beforehand. Upon arrival, they discovered a broken fire door, a boarded-up window, and slugs and cockroach infestations. An investigation into the allegations of forgery has been launched. This has been your Teachers Talk Radio News with Joe Fox.
Teaching is a rewarding profession, but it comes with its fair share of challenges. That's where ADAPT come in. We're not your typical trade union, but instead a modern, apolitical alternative, offering expert legal, employment and mental health support. Protection without the politics. So what makes ADAPT different? We're always apolitical and independent, specialised solely in supporting individual teachers. Our caseworkers are professionally qualified, ensuring you always get the best advice. Plus, there's 24/7 mental health support. Whether it's a simple contract check or handling serious allegations, ADAPT are here for you. Join the thousands of educators who've chosen ADAPT to protect their careers. Subscribe at adapt.org.uk today. ADAPT. Supporting school staff. Protecting careers.
So, welcome back, everybody. We have Professor Noel Purdy with us this evening. I'm absolutely delighted, chuffed, as we say around here, because Noel is always at the top of my list to have him on as a guest. So delighted to have him on now and to be talking about an absolute bang up to the moment report, Growing Up Online, in which Noel and I think it's 6 others have co-written, and it really just addresses the whole business of children and young people and what's going on online for them. Noel, you spoke to, I think it's 6,418 children That's quite a broad survey.
Yes, good evening, Paul. 6,500 responses to the survey really was a tremendous response. And, it certainly makes this the largest survey of its kind to be carried out in Northern Ireland, in relation to what our children and young people are experiencing online, both the positives and the negatives. We followed that up with some qualitative work as well. So there were interviews carried out with just under 100 children and young people, and some adults as well, some parents, teachers and other professionals as well. But so it was a mixed method study, both quantitative and qualitative.
Yeah. How did the report come about, Noel? What's kind of the rationale or the context?
Well, first of all, I have to acknowledge our funder, and that was the Safeguarding Board for Northern Ireland. So the SBNI, Safeguarding Board, funded this research to provide an evidence base, I guess, in relation to the implementation of the online safety strategy in Northern Ireland. That's an executive strategy that we have over in Northern Ireland. And I think there was a realization on the part of government and the Safeguarding Board as well that really there wasn't that evidence base currently in relation to what our children and young people are doing. And as you know, Paul, the online world changes so fast. So while there may have been some small studies carried out in the past, there was nothing current, nothing up to date, certainly nothing since COVID, and nothing of this scale. And the other thing which I think is very unique about this study is that the specification that was set out by the Safeguarding Board aimed very specifically to go above and beyond the normal mainstream, if you like, of children and young people. In Northern Ireland here, we have Section 75, which is essentially the groups of minority children and young people and those who might be at risk of marginalisation and so on. And so within the specification, there was a very clear desire to speak to a wider range as possible of children and young people. Now, we could have gone even further had we had more time to carry out this study, of course, but there was every effort made to try to go as widely as possible, particularly with the focus groups, as well as the survey. Of course, we were indebted to the Education Authority in Northern Ireland, who sent the survey link to every school in Northern Ireland, mainstream and special. And that really helped us in terms of getting the word out. But I'd have to say that we were absolutely delighted with the response. But even since we launched the report a couple of weeks ago, we've been really delighted with the extent of public interest in this, because this is not surprised, but probably pleased that people are interested in this. It wasn't a huge surprise, I suppose, because we know that educators and indeed parents are very concerned about what their children are up to online and are the dangers that they're potentially exposed to online as well. So we weren't hugely surprised, but at the same time, we have been amazed by just how much traction there has been to this unique report.
Yeah. It's very moot. It's very of the moment. Now, I'll get into trouble for saying this, Noel, but quite often, academics and people do outstanding research. It's magnificent. It's fantastic. It's published and so on. And then it sits on shelves and it gathers dust. Now, this is maybe a little bit different. Who is this report really aimed at? Because it's very accessible. It's a very easy kind of read. Now, that's not to take away at all from the depth and quality of it.
Well, I mean, I think as a researcher, as an academic, I share your frustration that a lot of research does maybe gather dust on shelves, and that's certainly our aim through the research was to try and change policy and practice. It's certainly the aim of our funder, the Safeguarding Board for Northern Ireland, and they were very keen that this would feed into and inform the implementation of the online safety strategy in Northern Ireland. So, obviously the report's just been published a couple of weeks ago, but I would be determined, as I know the Safeguarding Board are determined, that this report will be used to provide that evidential basis for future policy direction, which will ultimately serve to help support our children and young people and to keep them safer online in Northern Ireland. So in terms of who it's aimed at, I suppose it's aimed at a very wide audience. I'm pleased that you found it accessible because, research at its best has to be readable and accessible. The report itself, as you know, Paul, is almost 300 pages long, but there is an executive summary which is 4 or 5 pages long, and the Safeguarding Board have very kindly asked us to produce some child-friendly outputs over the coming weeks, and that will also help to disseminate the findings of this study to a wider audience.
Yeah, the executive summary is very helpful, and it's very clear, very well set out and laid out, and very easy for people to read. And then, as you say, supporting that, there's 290 odd pages, and the depth to which you and your researchers have gone is fantastic. And we're going to hear from many of them very shortly. What's really interesting, Noel, is of course the findings are really interesting, but one of them that's really, really interesting, and it's quite striking, is that children's online lives for them are very positive. As adults, we can be quite scared. We're parents, we're teachers, we worry about what goes on. But children themselves find their own lives very rewarding. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
That's absolutely right. And we were very keen at the outset, Paul, to ensure that this was a balanced piece of research, that we weren't setting out simply to paint a negative picture. And often in the media, there is this uniquely negative discourse around children's online experiences. And this is not to deny that there are dangers out there and that there are risks, of course, and occasionally those risks are quite significant. But the predominant message from the children and young people that we spoke to was that they really enjoyed being online and that they used it. They used it for a very wide range of different activities. I mean, I spoke to a lot of the teenagers in focus groups and post-primary schools across Northern Ireland. And I remember very clearly, one young man sitting next to me saying that he couldn't survive without Spotify, the music streaming app, and yes. Others were saying that there was nothing better than spending some time at the weekend playing FIFA with their mates online. Others were talking about streaming videos, about shopping, about messaging their friends, about sharing photographs, and about following celebrities and influencers. Some were watching training videos for hockey and football. Others were listening to music and watching videos. But universally, the young people were saying that there were lots of positives about being online. One interesting finding as well was that, of course, the young people were saying that this is integral to what it's like to be a child or a young person today, and that that highlights that generational difference, Paul. That folk like myself who grew up in an age without mobile phones and without the internet, for us this can seem a little strange or different or dispensable, but for those children who are growing up today, being online is part and parcel of what it is to be a young person. And that's exactly what one of the young people said. We're teenagers. What do you expect? We're online. And that for parents and grandparents' generations is perhaps a little bit more difficult to understand. The other thing that we found...
And yet, Noel, and sorry to interrupt you, but when I first got my hands on your report, and you're very upfront, you talk about the positive experiences first. It's the first finding, and it's the early chapters. But my sense, my mental picture was of a life that's very vibrant, happy, rewarding. Online life, it's very enriching and rewarding for young people. And I have to say, I found some comfort in that.
I think that's right. And as I said, it's not to deny that there are dangers and challenges, and I'm sure we'll come on to talk about those. But
we will.
But at the start of the interviews with the children and young people, and indeed at the start of the survey, we were keen to explore what the positives were, because that hasn't been explored very much in the past. There have been some studies that have looked at this. Barbara Spears, who's a colleague of mine from Adelaide in Australia, did some work across Europe a few years ago, and I know that she was adamant from listening to the voice of children and young people that there were so many positives about being online that simply weren't being acknowledged. And let's be honest, Paul, as parents, we wouldn't allow our children any access to online technology if we thought that it was universally dangerous and negative. Many of our young people, for example, through COVID, being online was one of the only ways in which they could actually keep in touch with their friends. They weren't allowed to go out of their house except once a day for a walk. They weren't allowed to play football with their friends in the street. Being online and playing FIFA or whatever it was that they were playing on their Xbox or PlayStation was one of the few ways in which they could interact with their peers. So actually being online at that stage, was actually a source of really important social interaction.
Yeah, very important. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And is it fair to say, Noel, that the findings in your report could be extrapolated, across, other countries, across the world, maybe?
Paul, I'm sure that what we have discovered here in Northern Ireland isn't unique to Northern Ireland. I mean, there were no questions which were specifically geared at Northern Ireland. Now, many other pieces of research, of course, the context of Northern Ireland and its divided past and post-conflict society and so on, a lot of that features large in many other research studies. But in terms of what we were asking the children and young people, I don't really think that had any bearing on what they were doing at all. So I would be confident that what our young people here are experiencing could be mirrored in any other Western country.
Great, yeah. So I've been lucky enough to spend, the greater part of a week, more or less, talking to your colleagues. I went out and I met some of them, and we talked about lots of different issues. I spoke to Dr. Karen Orr. That was this morning. I spoke to Karen, and we talked a lot about the amount of time that children spend online. And this is what Karen and I had to say.
I think, as with a lot of the groups that we spoke to, the first thing that struck me was just how pervasive the use of the internet was for these young women. It was definitely something that they were using all day, every day. Really, it was very much a core part of their lives. And as with other groups, they're able to look at their phone and they're able to tell you exactly how long it is they're spending online, and it's really from the minute their eyes open until they fall asleep. And even for some young people, as I'm sure has come up with the other groups, it's even interrupting that sleep, and it's throughout the night. So definitely these young women, these young girls, they were using the internet all throughout the day, and that was on school days as well as weekends as well. So it is just so normal to them. It's like an extension of their hand. It's very much their phone that they're using to access the internet, and it's very much just a standard everyday part of their lives.
If you have the right device nowadays, you will get a weekly report telling you how much screen time you've spent in the last 7 days. It can be quite shocking sometimes, particularly as an adult, to realize you've spent hours per day. Can you give us an amount of time per day that these young people were spending looking at their devices?
Here, we did measure that in terms of how long do you spend online on an ordinary school day. You have 17.8% there are 1 to 2 hours, 16.4 2 to 3 hours. We have it in the survey. It's sort of disaggregated by the younger sample and an older sample. Some of the questions were tweaked a little bit. We only went as high as about 7 hours or more. And like, for example, here with the younger group, if you look at the weekends, there was quite a large proportion, 17% nearly, were saying about 7 hours or more, certainly in terms of some of the focus groups I had been a part of. I think one kid even said like 23 out of 24 hours a day. It was so high. Now, and saying that, that could be streaming music, that could be, that mightn't be actively participating in online activity. Obviously, the way in which young people use the internet is so varied. Exactly how they're spending that time is a little bit more nuanced. But even with these young women, it was constant. So the quantitative data that Noel will talk about later, I'm sure will give a bit more flavour to that. But even they're looking at the 14 to 18-year-olds in the survey. We've 22% saying that they use it 7 hours or more on a Saturday and a Sunday. And even, kids were saying they were coming into school absolutely exhausted. They're coming in wrecked because they're just up all night, even on the internet and using their phones. So yeah, that was something that struck me, was just how the normalization that you mentioned and just how pervasive it is. It's throughout the day, and it's school days and weekends.
Oh, I get my volume back on again, get going again, get my mic going. So yeah, that's very interesting comments from Karen there. Our children do spend a lot of time online, Noel.
Yeah, I mean that's certainly one of the findings, and there is a lot of debate around this screen time, and it's a bit more complicated than the headlines sometimes suggest. So yes, we did find that a lot of our children and young people are spending many hours per day during the week, and of course more at the weekend and on holiday, and when they're on holiday. But of course the impact of that, as Karen suggested, I spoke to a lot of those teenagers who were telling me about their friends coming in wrecked and in a complete state, and their heads were down on the desk, and they were saying that that's very normal for a lot of their friends to have their phones with them during the night and to be staying up very late and getting used to having 4, 5, 6 hours sleep or less, and feeling tired the next day. So that kind of behavior, I think that was certainly one of the findings of our study. But if you look at research that's been carried out around screen time, it is a bit more complicated than that, because there doesn't seem to be evidence for a causal link necessarily between the amount of time that young people spend online and, say, mental health difficulties. There does seem to be some correlation, but the causality is not quite clear. So in other words, it's not clear whether spending a lot of time online can create mental health difficulties, or whether it's mental health difficulties can lead to young people spending a lot of time online, or what that link might be. So it is a bit complicated. The other thing is, of course, that there is a difference between different types of online activities. So for example, and some of these are more absorbing of children's attention than others. For example, to go back to the young man I was speaking to who listens to Spotify, well, you can listen to music and get on with quite a lot of other activities. Whereas gaming, for instance, is probably much more consuming of your attention and so on. What the literature suggests, and it's certainly what we find as well, is that the danger is often that spending excessive amounts of time online can displace other health promoting activities, and that's where I think there's a real risk. And by health promoting activities, I mean basic things like sleeping, but also eating healthily, taking exercise, interacting with members of their family and indeed their peers face to face. Other health promoting activities can suffer if you're spending excessive amounts of time online. However, some other researchers have come up with what they've called the digital Goldilocks hypothesis. I'm not sure if you've heard of that, Paul, or if your listeners have. But essentially,
I haven't heard of it, but I like the sound of it.
Well, if you think of Goldilocks and think of your children's fairy tale story about Goldilocks and tasting the porridge or trying out the beds, and some were too small or some were too large, or the porridge was too cold or it was too hot, and eventually, of course, Goldilocks found one that was just right. Well, in terms of the amount of time that children spend online, this hypothesis suggests that there's a just right amount of time for children to spend online. In other words, if they don't spend any time online or very minimal time online, they can actually be at risk. I mean, first of all, they lose out on so many of the benefits, but also they may not develop any of the skills to protect themselves online. Of course, then the converse of that is that if they're online for excessive amounts of time, and Karen mentioned there, one young person claimed that they'd been online 23 out of the previous 24 hours and felt absolutely fine. Well, I can't imagine how that could be the case. And to go back to that suggestion about displacing other health promoting activities, I mean, clearly there's something out of kilter if our children and young people are spending 23 hours a day. Now, that was way out of proportion to the majority, but as Karen said, roughly a fifth of our 14 to 18-year-olds were spending 7 hours or more online at the weekends, and that's a lot of time.
It's a lot of time, but as you say, Noel, it's much more nuanced than that. And listening to Spotify while you're out cycling, for example, is very different from being on a social media site.
Exactly.
Now,
and the other thing, of course, that we didn't specify is that whether they were using the internet through their phones or tablets for doing homework. And of course, children increasingly are being asked to go on to Google Classroom to access homework and to watch videos or to upload work or indeed to type their homeworks and research pictures for art projects or whatever it is, as some of my children do, and all of that counts as time online as well. So again, that's not necessarily a negative at all. In fact, it could be very much a positive. So we do have to be careful that we don't immediately jump to conclusions that children today, young people today, are spending far too much time online and it's always bad. And what we find and in our research from the young people is that there are many positives there, but there's also different types of online activities, and we just need to be careful that we don't necessarily jump to those stereotypical conclusions.
Mm-hmm. Which of course is easy for us adults to do, and that's maybe from a position of concern or fear or worry.
Well, that's it. And of course, parents often see that kind of screen time issue as a total battlefield, and in many homes, and we heard this from the parents that we spoke to. Other research has found it as well that this issue of their children being online is what's been termed a locus of conflict. In other words, it's a source of family rows. You're not on your phone again. Would you get off your phone? And who among us as parents hasn't said that at some stage to our teenage children?
Yeah.
And yet the point is, it's not necessarily always negative. Excessive time can displace health promoting activities, but we just need to be balanced in our approach and also speak to children and young people about what exactly they're doing online.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Now, we did go on then to talk about, the impact of the amount of time that children do spend online and so on. And yes, we fully accept that there are a large number of positives, and that's great to see. But of course, there are some detrimental things. So first of all, we'll hear from Dr. Deborah Webster and then again from Karen Orr.
Deborah, what are some of the things teachers are seeing as the impact of excessive screen use?
That was one of the things that came out, a huge concern for teachers in primary school, special school, post-primary as well, and just the fact that children are on their phones at night time when they should be sleeping, and there's loads of research about that. It's just, we really need to encourage children and parents more so that these phones shouldn't be in their bedrooms at night time. I've seen a real change in that in the last couple of years with primary school pupils, and it's just there's more of a normality that we keep our phones in bed. And I'll say, where do you put your phone? Where do you put your phone when you go to sleep at night? Under my pillow. my bedside table. The teachers were saying children are coming to school tired, can't be bothered, no motivation, and simply because they're not getting enough sleep. The reason we need sleep is not just for physically our bodies, but for our brains, for our mental health, for our well-being, and the research would show that. So that's a real concern for teachers and something that is out of their control. All they can do is encourage this, but obviously it's at home where this is allowed and needs to change for many families.
Karen, from your research, what did you find to be the impact and consequences of young people spending 7 or 8 hours a day on their screens?
Well, I think some of the data we have would speak to, in terms of a school day, just the tiredness and the exhaustion that young people are coming into school, and their, teachers commented on seeing children exhausted and half asleep at the back of the classroom. And there is definitely an impact. A child coming into school absolutely shattered. They're not going to be ready to learn. They're not going to be in the best position to get as much out of their school day as they possibly can. Additionally, it's going to, any activity that is taking up that amount of time is going to be displacing other activities. We all know everything in moderation and about creating that balance. And I must say, I'm in no means to preach to anybody about that. I think sometimes adults are as bad. When I look at my screen time on my phone, I'm horrified at how long I'm there each day. So I suppose we all know that it's everything in moderation, practicing that, and even showing good practice as a parent, I think it's harder than it sounds. So, but yes, we know that if children are online, they're maybe not out getting fresh air, they're maybe not being active, they're maybe not spending time with their family downstairs at the kitchen table, or any of these other factors. But I do think, how kids who are playing sports and who are actively engaged in other activities, that from the parental point of view, they felt that maybe that was beneficial because they weren't spending all their time online. Do you know what I mean? So, but yes, certainly, I think that the capacity for a young person to exercise that moderation is somewhat limited. And we, it's inevitable that a child spending all their time online, whilst there's benefits to it. And I think this research has been really good at pointing out the benefits. It's not all a scary horror story. It's absolutely not. So I think there is definitely benefits to it. But it's the excessiveness in which it's being used. I think there needs to be some cautionary tale around that moderation and just how young people can manage their time better, so that their use of being online is not displacing other healthy, social, beneficial activities like their schoolwork, like their family time, like their face-to-face friends time. So definitely there's lessons to be learned there.
Deborah, as teachers, parents, adults, caregivers, we tend to have a rather bleak outlook of the internet where children are concerned. But the gamut of online activity is huge. I mean, there are young people who enjoy playing games, they enjoy contacting their friends, they enjoy making videos and doing all these TikTok dances and so on. And then maybe at the other extreme, there are the frightening stories that make the news headlines, can end tragically. Can you categorize the online world of children for us so maybe we can understand it a little bit better?
So I would categorise the risks under the 4 C's. Now, this is not original to me. This is from Professor Sonia Livingstone. The 4 C's would be, first of all, content. The content that young people are viewing online, okay, what they're seeing, what the videos are. The second C would be contact, who is contacting them. So we're thinking about people who are maybe bullying them and people that they've not met before in real life. The third C is conduct, how they conduct themselves. So them as a user, them saying things that they would never say to somebody's face, okay? Them accepting friend requests that they shouldn't. And the final and the fourth C is contract. So that's anything where money passes hands. If you think about younger children, spending their parents' money on skins and things for their avatars, or even scams or blackmailing. as well. So those are how I would categorise the 4 risks. I would say as well as that, there is the impact on their well-being, how it impacts their self-esteem, their body image, their mood. All of these things can be impacted by spending hours and hours watching edited videos and posts of other people, whether they're celebrities or their peers. And the impact that can have on them can be absolutely massive.
So, very interesting comments there about the impact of an online life. And yes, of course, we do credit the positive aspects, but we do have to acknowledge, that there are, there are kind of negative dimensions to this. Is it fair to say then that, virtual life is really to the detriment of real life?
Well, Paul, we asked the children and young people, had they experienced anything nasty or unpleasant online in the previous couple of months? And what we found was that among the younger cohort, that's 8 to 13-year-olds, that 20% of them said that they had. And among the older ones, that's the 14 to 18-year-olds, that was 18%. Now, that's roughly 1 in 5 children and young people then having experienced something nasty or unpleasant in the previous couple of months. We asked different questions to the younger cohort than we did to the older ones. We gave a wider range of options because, of course, we went on and asked them, well, what sorts of nasty or unpleasant things did you experience online? But in both age categories, the most common was that somebody had been mean to them online or made mean or nasty comments. And I suppose that fits within what we might term, cyberbullying or online bullying, that traditional sort of definition of online bullying. But among the older ones, we gave them a much wider range of different possible negative online experiences. And here things were more disturbing. So as well as what we might term cyberbullying, being victimized in terms of nasty comments or rumors or things like that, we also find that between 3 and 5% of the young people had been sent inappropriate photographs, had been sent pornography. Embarrassing photos of them had been edited without their permission, or maybe they were asked to send nude photos of themselves, or they'd seen material which were promoting suicide or self-harm or eating disorders or violence, or maybe they'd been threatened and so on. So those also featured among some of the nasty or unpleasant experiences. And I suppose most disturbingly, what we found was that girls were much more likely to be victimized online, particularly in relation to sexual forms of victimization than boys were. So I'll give you a couple of examples, maybe Paul here. So among the older category, we're talking here, the 14 to 18-year-olds, girls were 3 times more likely than boys to be asked to send nude photographs of themselves. They were more than twice as likely to be sent inappropriate photographs that they didn't ask for. They were twice as likely to see or be sent pornography. They were also more likely to see or be sent content promoting self-harm, eating disorders, or suicide. And those findings, although probably in line with other previous studies, were still very disturbing. In Northern Ireland, we have a strategy being prepared at the moment by government on ending violence against women and girls. And this feeds in perfectly into that strategy, because what it does is it provides that evidence that our girls are even more vulnerable than our boys online, and particularly in relation to sexualized forms of victimization. So that's a real issue. The evidence is very clear. Karen mentioned there that she had spoken to a group of young women in a disadvantaged inner city youth club setting. And those young women in their mid to late teens, I think were recounting some really quite disturbing experiences of adult men interacting with them in very negative ways. And yet what Karen said is also true, that the girls sometimes seem to almost accept that as that was kind of normalized behavior, that had happened so frequently that it didn't seem to bother them. They just blocked the offender and moved on. And that in itself, I think, is disturbing. And it aligns with what we found in this study as well around reporting. Because what we found was that actually among that older cohort, only about 30% of the 14 to 18-year-olds said that they reported negative online experiences to anybody. Now, it was higher among the younger children, as you would imagine. So it's 45% there among the 18 to 13-year-olds, but less than a third of the older ones actually reported these negative online experiences.
We're going to come to that shortly, Noel, in a little bit more detail. But I wonder, just to take you back then to one thing, do we know why girls are more vulnerable to experience what you've described there?
I'm not sure we know why, except that it's related to their gender, and they're victimized often by boys or adult men. And this is not the first study to have found that, Paul, but what it does is, certainly in the Northern Ireland context, is it provides very clear evidence that there's a need to address this and to protect our children and young people generally, but particularly our girls, against this form of victimization, which is, as I read out there, 2 or 3 times more likely to happen to them than it is to boys. Now, it's not that we shouldn't be also aiming to support and protect our boys. We do need to do that as well. But clearly there's a role for education here in terms of, combating the kind of misogynistic, sexualized behavior, which seems to be pervasive among some online communities and so on, and clearly perpetuated more by boys and adult men than by girls. So there are real issues here around the victimization of girls that need to be addressed urgently.
Absolutely, and as you say, there is a real need to protect, but there's quite a bind or quite a dilemma then, because as you say, and we're going to hear now very shortly from Dr. Amelia Symington and again from Dr. Karen Orr, children don't always report. So let's hear maybe why that is.
What goes on with reporting patterns between younger children and older children?
Primary school children's first protocol was, if something happens, I'll tell my mum, I'll tell my dad, I'll tell my granny, I'll tell my brother. Their first response, they didn't really talk about reporting online. The first response was, I'll tell a family member. So I don't know at what point that changes, why you hit 11 and suddenly you don't tell your parents anything, but that definitely seemed to be the distinction, that the primary school children, that was their response, that if there was an issue, well, I'll tell my parents.
However, you discovered that older children are not in the habit of reporting. What reasons did they give you for that?
The reason that they were giving for why they wouldn't report is that nothing would happen anyway. And they gave a couple of examples of times where they had friends or acquaintances who had reported things and then nothing happened. And so their attitude wasn't, you shouldn't report because it's okay to do. Their attitude was, you shouldn't report because it does nothing. And I think they kind of were saying it's such a, so many of the apps and social media and things, they use automated kind of checking to see if something is abuse or not. It's such a long process. By the time you've reported it, by the time you hear anything back, the issue's kind of already moved on, and they just kind of said it isn't handled well enough to make it worthwhile reporting. So if you're on Instagram, for example, and someone sends you a message that's abusive, you can report their account to Instagram. But they were saying that the responses are automated. So unless they use specific terms or unless they meet a certain threshold, nothing will happen anyway.
Is it fair to say children know what to do when they encounter risky things online?
That is the thing as well, because we ask them about what do you do if you're faced with a danger or something that you perceive as being dangerous. And they could rehearse, you block them, you report them, you go to a trusted adult, but it wasn't necessarily, those weren't necessarily actions that they would exercise, So there was a general consensus, I think, across a lot of the groups we spoke to, that there was no point in reporting these incidences. Young people didn't feel that anything was going to come of it. It is just very normalised, these online interactions, that to me were quite, to them, we're really wrong of the mill.
That sense of hopelessly enduring what goes on in this underworld is very concerning, very worrying indeed. But am I right in saying you found out that it's not that young people tolerate this in isolation, it's just they don't tell teachers or parents, but they will disclose to peers and others?
A sibling or somebody in their youth setting rather than a parent or somebody in the school.
So, yeah, younger children, okay, fair enough. They tell a family member, and that's great. And at least that's a human being that they're telling. And generally, you know, the consensus there seems to be something happens, and that's all good. Older children don't report, and you know they're very cynical. They're contemptuous of reporting mechanisms that exist as they are at the minute. Should something be done by these tech companies? Do they not bear a responsibility to ensure the children's safety?
Well, again, this is a complex issue, Paul. So first of all, you know, just let me go back a little bit. It's not that young people never tell anyone. They do. You know, if something negative happens online, they will tell. But we know from previous studies, and we find exactly the same thing, that they're more likely to tell their friends than anyone else. And that's particularly the case among the older category, the older age group of 14 to 18-year-olds, much more likely to tell their friends than anyone else. Among the younger ones, it's still their friends were the most common person to tell, but
Okay.
closely followed by family members, parents and other adults in the family and so on. Among the older cohort, there was a big difference. So it was by far more likely to tell friends than family. That's probably something to do with adolescence, I would imagine, and those lines of communication during adolescence in families, which can become a little bit more strained. But they sometimes will tell teachers. But in line with previous studies, this is not a surprise. They're much less likely to tell teachers directly, much more likely to tell friends and then family. Now that in itself,
when I was at school, you know, when I was teaching full time, Monday mornings always brought its fair share of issues that had happened over the weekend, and rarely, very rarely now, Noel, did you hear directly from the child that was at the centre of the issue. However, the friends of that child who may have been in the chat or may be aware somehow of what happened, very often they would approach you quietly and they would say, listen, excuse me, sir, you need to speak to so-and-so. It's been a bad weekend. And then, you know, when you would approach the child, you know, you would get disclosures of what happened. That's very often how it came about.
Yeah, that doesn't surprise me at all. And, you know, I think there is an encouragement here that they're telling somebody, but they will tell their friends first. And the encouragement here for schools, I think, and other folk working with children and young people is to try and empower that peer group and to accept the reality that if a child or young person experiences something nasty and they want to tell someone, they're much more likely to tell their friendship group. And that friendship group, then they need to know what to do. They need to know to go and tell a trusted adult, whether that's a teacher or a youth worker or some other trusted adult, but they need to have the confidence to do that. And that's where the training can be really effective. So, you know, if schools are only telling young people to come immediately and tell a teacher, I think they're missing a trick in a way, because that's probably unrealistic and it's certainly not what we're finding in the research. If they tell a peer, that's better than telling nobody, and then the peer can report that on to someone else. But as Karen and Millie were saying, there is a low level of satisfaction which we found with how matters were being dealt with. You know, almost half of that older category of 14 to 18-year-olds felt that when they did report something, it wasn't being dealt with very well. And that does bring us to that issue, Paul, that you mentioned there about the tech companies. And here I think there is some optimism. As your listeners will know, the online safety bill has just been signed off in the last month or so by both houses of Parliament at Westminster. It's about to gain royal assent any day now, we hope. And that online safety bill, which has been going through Parliament for quite some time, could potentially be a real game changer in terms of the behaviour of social media platforms and these tech companies. For far too long, a lot of these companies have really been doing very little or not doing as much as they might. Now, this online safety bill, when it becomes law, has the power to impose really quite significant fines. I think it's £18 million or 10% of the annual revenue of these tech companies, which is a considerable amount of money, which can be levied if they fail to protect the young people, if they fail to remove offensive material, if they fail to impose age verification measures for the children and young people. So it'll be very, very interesting to see in the coming weeks and months whether the Online Safety Bill, the Online Safety Act, as it will become very soon, if that really does live up to its potential to change things, to make the tech companies stand up finally and act more proactively and more rapidly to protect children and young people, because up until now, clearly that's been an issue, and there's been wide disparity among the social media companies as well. Some are doing a little bit more than others, some are doing very little indeed, and this should, we hope anyway, be a real game changer.
And I mean, to be able to, prevent a lot of issues at source, so to speak, would be very good, very useful for everybody. If they're going to say you need to be 13 before you can, be on games, or 18 for Call of Duty. And there's some way of verifying and ensuring that happens, that would prevent a lot of exposure to, all sorts of things.
I think it would, because, we spoke to lots of young people, teenagers, 14, 15-year-olds who were saying, look, it's very, very easy to fake your date of birth on these sites and to get online. And of course, as someone pointed out, if you do that when you're 9 or 10 and you pretend that you're 13, well, whenever you're 13...
You've been...
Sorry.
Whenever you're 13, then... those sites assume that you're 18, and suddenly you've got access to a whole world of adult material that really you shouldn't be having access to at all. So it's not only just at that younger age that the danger lies, but it's also then that fake date of birth allows access to adult sites at a very young age.
Yes, because that would almost automatically open up floodgates, because the internet is going to believe that you're 18 and therefore you're, legally able to receive all that information and so on. Yeah. Noel, can I take you back to one thing? So, you talked about there are maybe technical things that can be done. But when children report issues in school and so on, you talked about, schools are maybe missing a trick there and so on. But is it fair to say that it's really important that there is like a very much a pastoral and a very much a human response to children who have had issues and difficulties, and that would be, founded on fundamentals, like trust, empathy, and so on?
Absolutely. And actually, the children and young people that we spoke to were very positive about what their schools were doing. Of course, they were saying, look, they can always do more. But actually, we asked the young people about the training that they'd received around online safety. And with no exceptions, they were saying that they had been well trained, that their school teachers, whether it was their pastoral head or their year head or their form tutor or whoever it was, had often spoken to them about online safety. So this was something that they had been trained in. And indeed, in the survey, something like 96 or 97% of the children and young people reported that they had received online safety training. Indeed, what we found was that those who had received the training were then less likely to report negative online experiences. So that correlation was very interesting, Paul, because that seemed to...
I read that, Noel, and I have to say now that I did, that pulled me up a little bit. Can you tell us about why that might be?
Well, I suppose we can assume that perhaps these children and young people having received the training, we're more aware of the dangers, more aware also then of how to protect themselves and, not to be sharing information, not to be interacting with strangers, how to keep their accounts private and not open to anybody coming in. And so we can assume perhaps that as a result of the online safety training that they received, that they'd actually learnt more skills and were therefore able to protect themselves and therefore experienced fewer of those nasty or unpleasant experiences. So I think again, there's some encouragement there, and that correlation was significant there for us. So schools are doing a good job. Of course, they'll always want to do more. Of course, there's always more that we can do, and the big challenge for schools is keeping abreast of the latest app and the latest technology and so on. So I know that schools often struggle with that. But to go back to what you said, Paul, sometimes, and I say this to my student teachers as well in college at Stranmillis, that relationship that they have with their pupils is crucially important. If a child is distressed and there's something has happened that they want to come and talk about, whether it's something that's happened to them or one of their friends, they won't go to a member of staff who they feel is not interested and has no relationship with them or no personal interest. They'll go to a member of staff, whoever it is, who they trust and who has that pastoral care relationship with them. And again, I think that's a real encouragement or endorsement of the pastoral role of the educator. And it's something that I'm forever saying to my student teachers, that pastoral care is all about relationship. And you see that whenever there is a distressing situation and the children come to those members of staff with whom they already have this established relationship of trust and respect.
I think you're absolutely right. Yeah. And I know many years ago, when I was training as a student teacher, that whole sense of approachability, authenticity, genuineness, and so on, they were hammered into us, those qualities. But they're absolutely vital, and maybe even more so needed nowadays.
Well, I think it's crucially important, and I think to be honest, I'm maybe straying off a little bit, but I think it's crucially important today that with all the pressure on teachers around attainment and assessment and grades and standards and so on, that they don't forget about relationship and about the well-being of the pupils that they're working with. And I think that's something that we forget at our peril, really, as educators as well. That ultimately, these are children and young people who we're looking after, who we're caring for during the day, and we need to think about that before we start educating.
I don't think we're getting off piste at all. I think you're absolutely spot on. Over 37 years of teaching and 4 of those as an education advisor and so on. One of the things I used to say, it's almost like a catchphrase, is, if we teach children and young people to become good people, confident, enterprising, self-reliant, trustworthy, and so on and so forth, well, then they automatically kind of fill the academic potential that they have. To me, one follows the other, but you need to be careful which one you put first. And I do think it's important that you put the person and developing that person first, and then that academic follows.
Yeah, and I think the two are linked, and too often there's this kind of dichotomous assumption, that the pastoral and the academic are at opposite ends of a spectrum, whereas, of course, any experienced educator will tell you that they're very closely linked, and children who are feeling safe and secure and cared for will be ready to learn, and those who don't will not be in a position to learn. So those schools which are successful schools have often appreciated that, and they have members of staff who are both skilled teachers and experts in their chosen subject and so on, but they're also communicators, and they're also interested in the pupils as individuals. And I often say to my students as well to think of their favorite teacher from when they were at school, and without exception. They always think of somebody who knew them by name, who had a personal interest in them, who was encouraging and supportive. And yes, I'm sure were a good teacher as well. But those other things were what they remember about their favorite teacher from often, 10, 20 years earlier.
So true. So true. Now, one of the things I spoke to Dr. Deborah Webster about was a specific aspect of kind of online activities. And that was, if you like, the power of influencers. So let's listen now to what Deborah had to say.
It seems to me from the report and listening to the researchers that the vast majority of children, certainly in Northern Ireland where the report's based, and I'm sure we can extrapolate it out to other places, the vast majority of children manage themselves very maturely, very sensibly and very well online. They encounter issues and they either ignore them, and certainly if they're younger, they report them, the issues get managed, and they're back enjoying themselves online again and getting good and positive benefits from them. I wonder, could we look for a moment at the role of influencers? Because influencers, to my mind, have a very specific purpose. They're called influencers. They want to exert an influence over children, and they certainly do that. And very often their motives are money or sales. Well, that's going to end up in money anyhow. And they don't have the same kind of ethics, moralities, codes of practice and responsibilities that teachers have, which would be to educate within that framework. And, we educate physically, intellectually, emotionally, spiritually. We aim for balance. We want to educate the whole child. But influencers have the ability to kind of reach right into children's lives. We've learned, for example, through talking to people and reading the report, that many children sleep with their phones under their pillows. They can wake up in the middle of the night to an alert that's sent out by an influencer, which lets the child know that a new video, a new pop song, whatever it is, has been released. And, we struggle to get children to do homework, but a child will respond to a ping on their phone at 3 o'clock in the morning to waking up and watch a video from an influencer. That's power. And I'm just wondering then, what's the role of influencers? And in particular, what's their impact on having children compare themselves with each other and the lifestyle of the influencer?
I think it's almost a human natural response when you look at other things and other people to compare. And I think particularly if you're in an adolescent stage in life, well, you're only really finding out who you are. And your body, of course, is changing all the time. And what a lot of young people are doing is they're spending time looking at the edited bodies of other people. Hours and hours often. And these edited images, whether they are of influencers, peers, celebrities, many of them have hours and hours work gone into them behind the scenes, And whether it's their fake tan, their own hairdresser, their personal makeup artist, somebody who's sorted out the lighting, all of this going on in the background, and yet it's made to look very natural. And young people, lovely, ordinary young people, are comparing their everyday, normal selves with these edited selves of other people. And then they are feeling maybe a wee bit envious, but maybe more than that, their self-esteem can be hit. And young people would say, there's this standard and I don't meet that standard. And I'll be honest with you, if I spent hours looking at edited bodies of other people my age, I would probably start to think there was something wrong with the way I looked, or my nose was funny, or my brows weren't quite right. So this is a real challenge. They're spending a lot of time doing that and then comparing to how they feel. And it's a real challenge, not just for girls, and not for all girls, but some boys and not all boys. It's definitely a challenge and an issue. And I would also say not just for young people, I say for some adults as well. And that, if they're doing that, that can impact their own children. Definitely. And that's why I feel we need to educate all children that these things are edited, that these images are filtered. We need to talk about it more so that they have that awareness at the back of their heads. Eating disorders in Northern Ireland have massively grown since the lockdown. And also research would show that we are spending more time online and young people are online more than previously. Obviously, the internet did not create eating disorders. They've been around for a long time. However, it does make you think, by carrying this in their pockets and looking at it on a regular basis, it has perhaps had an influence.
I suppose one of the reasons, I kind of pushed Deborah on that was it takes me back to a particular incident that we dealt with in school, which involved influencers and anorexia and so on. It was just, not a nice incident at all. But influencers have a very powerful reach, don't they?
Well, they do, and certainly we asked the children and young people about this in the survey and also in the focus groups as well. We found that the majority of the children and young people did follow celebrities or influencers. That figure was higher, as over 3/4 of the older cohort. And actually, when you look at it by gender, girls were more likely than boys even to follow celebrities and influencers. It wasn't a huge difference, but they were definitely more likely by maybe 5 or 10%, I think, from the younger cohort and also the older cohort. When we asked them whether that influence was positive or negative, more than 4 out of 5, over 80% believed that it was a good influence, that these celebrities and influencers were exerting a positive influence on them. And actually, a relatively small percentage felt that their behavior was actually influenced, and that percentage was lower among the older cohort. Now, that, I suppose, is to be expected. In other words, that those older teenagers, the 14 to 18-year-olds, only 8.5% thought that their behavior was influenced by celebrities and influencers. That was higher. It was 13% among the younger ones, perhaps suggesting that those older ones are a little bit more savvy and a little bit more aware of some of those things that Deborah was talking about in the clip around airbrushing and celebrities being made to look even better than they might in real life and so on. So I think, again, we need to be careful here, because we ask questions about celebrities and influencers, and not every celebrity or influencer has a negative influence. Let's be honest. I remember speaking to some of the teenagers, and they were following pop stars. They were following their favorite footballer often as well. They were watching videos of them training and shooting goals and so on. And were they influenced by their behavior? Well, I'm not so sure. Perhaps they were encouraged to train harder and to eat more healthily and so on. So it's not always negative at all. But when we did mention one particular influencer, then there was a lot of interest among the young people, and that's Andrew Tate. So we deliberately mentioned his name in the focus groups, and that proved to be very divisive. So the girls, without exception, were very negative in their response to Andrew Tate. The boys, much more mixed in terms of the response there. So we had some who didn't have much to say. We had some who felt that he had been perhaps misunderstood, and at least one who actually thought that his ideas, his conservative ideas, as the boy said, were actually to be welcomed. So that particular figure, very divisive. Very controversial, of course, in the news a lot at the moment, was certainly divided opinion among the groups that I spoke to.
Yeah. Yeah, I can understand that. Yeah. I wonder then, Noel, kind of a broader question. Do celebrities or influencers, do they make life for teachers more difficult? Because we're in a formal appointed position of influence. Influence is part of our job. Yes, we teach certain academic subjects, but when we consider our pastoral role, we are very much about the formation of character. We're about role modeling values and ways of being and so on and so forth. So I wonder, do influencers make our job more difficult, or are we just jealous that they've got all this fame and all this reach?
Well, I think there's different types of influence, probably, Paul. Here, I think let's not play down the importance of educators and teachers. And I think, children and young people are still very impressionable and still very influenced by the role models that they see day in, day out in front of them in classrooms and on the sports field. And it's still absolutely normal behavior for children to aspire to be like their teacher and to be kind and good fun and knowledgeable about subjects and so on. And we still see that. And I don't think that's going to change. Where I think there's good.
You've been listening to.
Sorry, that was me again.
Where I think there's a concern is what Deborah was talking about there, I suppose, is around body image. And although we didn't really explore that in this piece of research, clearly there is other research out there that suggests that some children and young people can have really unrealistic expectations. And I suppose during adolescence in particular, when bodies are changing and body shape is changing, then it can have very negative impacts on both boys and girls. This is not just an issue that faces girls, because there's a lot of pressure now on boys and teenage boys to have a muscular physique, and that kind of pressure just wasn't an issue 20, 30, 40 years ago, but it is very much now for teenage boys, and that's not something that we perhaps have addressed very much, and there's still a big focus on the girls, and rightly so, but actually there's pressure on boys too now to conform to that idealized image of bulked up and super fit and six pack and all the rest of it that unfortunately is prevalent on social media as well.
Yeah. Noel, time's moving on us, and there's still quite a few important areas I would like us to cover. One of the key things that comes across in the report then is this notion of involving young people in the programs and the teaching and the educating around online work. Now, earlier in the week, I spoke to Dr. Leanne York, who had much to say about involving young people in the programs that would be created.
Leanne, what's the case for involving young people in education around safety online?
One of the teenagers I spoke to said, you don't be doing anything for us without including us. And that's really come through in this professionals group as well, that young people do need to be involved. There's no point in us adults thinking that we know what to teach for online safety, when really the chances are we don't probably have a full idea of what children's lives are like. And because I think children themselves are the experts, they know what's happening within the online world. And I think the big thing is that we do need to include them and involve them.
And are they not included enough nowadays?
Well, I know from within the project, I wasn't involved in interviewing the young people, but I know within my own PhD, it seemed that that especially in maybe those more taboo, sensitive aspects in areas such as sexting, some of the young people were saying that it was barely mentioned within their school, or that it was just more or less that somebody come in and maybe talk to them in like a large assembly hall, where they didn't have the chance to ask questions, they didn't have the chance to have that discussion. So it seemed that definitely that for those issues like sexting, for instance, it seemed that the young people, that was a very small group that I was speaking to, but that was definitely something that they were very, very keen on, that young people need to have much more involvement in relation to the content.
I take your point about children having a knowledge that we as adults don't have. I wonder as well, do children want a safe space in which to talk about issues that they encounter online?
Yeah, and also maybe just the planning of what topics will we cover within online safety as well, because the chances are perhaps maybe if teachers or curriculum planners sit down to maybe think, and I'm not saying that they would do a bad job, but they may think to themselves, okay, right, we've covered everything here that would give them a good sound knowledge of being safe online. And perhaps maybe if children and young people were brought in on that planning, there may very well be something that they say, well, actually, we would like to learn about this or that. So I think it is important to think for to include the voice of the children and young people within that, and also as you say, perhaps maybe having that discussion and creating that safe space that they do feel safe, they do feel comfortable to talk about those issues. And I think that's where maybe sometimes online safety presentations given within maybe a full year group brought into the assembly hall. And I'm not saying anything against those. They're very good presentations, but it doesn't really give young people a chance to actually discuss some of the issues and really to unpack their own thinking around that. So that, again, through my own previous research, was something that they very much wanted smaller groups, to be able to talk, and not for schools to maybe brush over those more sensitive issues.
When we include children in our planning for online education, does it have other benefits? For example, are they more likely then to be safer online themselves?
Very much so, yeah. And I think it as well. You would, for the children and young people, if they're involved in that planning, they definitely will, as you say, take ownership of it, and they're much more likely probably to engage within that as well. And I think it is maybe just, as I said earlier, online safety shouldn't just focus on all the risks, all the dangers of the internet as well. It should also address, and that's even for parents, in any training programs for parents as well, not to paint it as this awful thing, because the internet provides so many benefits for children and young people, and even ourselves as adults as well. And I think that's also important to also make sure that people are aware of that too.
So there you have it. It's an absolute given, isn't it, that we have to involve young people now in any future education around, as you said at the outset of the programme, just things are evolving so quickly in that world. There are new apps, there are new ways of being.
Well, that's right, Paul, and there is that saying about nothing about us without us, and that compulsion, that encouragement to involve children and young people in discussions about actually, how they want to be taught around this, what's going to be most effective. Leanne made a very good point that we've heard in many studies that coming in and delivering an assembly and simply talking at young people, while it kind of some effect, is not nearly as effective as engaging in a small group level and giving children and young people an opportunity to discuss and ask questions. These are important issues, and opening up and being honest, I suppose, about these challenging issues. Often the people who are most reluctant to talk about these issues are not the children and young people. It's the adult in the room, it's the teacher in the room. And this is where, teacher education, professional development for teachers becomes really important, that there's a need for more accessible, up-to-date, relevant, age-appropriate training for teachers so that they can as the educators who know the children best, that they can come in and deliver these sessions. And when I say deliver, I don't mean stand at the front and just talk at the children and young people, but plan interactive lessons where there's an opportunity for children and young people to learn, but also to ask questions and discuss.
I think absolutely. I think that's so right. Now, one of the things, and maybe we should listen to it now and move on, is that we did talk then about teachers and, as you point out rightly, some of their concerns or fears in addressing these thorny and prickly issues, and then what training might be needed. So again, it's Deborah Webster and Leanne York.
Nowadays, to be a teacher, you have to be well versed in technology, the online world, and so on. But much of what you've uncovered in your research is a kind of an underworld for children. It's certainly a place that teachers don't go and don't know a lot about. And, your research has definitely helped to bring that to our attention. So if it's not our world, I'm just wondering, are teachers able to? Are they prepared to? Are they trained? Are they able to manage children who are growing up online?
So the teachers also said that there were knowledge gaps. A lot of teachers don't use this stuff themselves. So then they're finding it really hard. They're dealing with an issue that's all to do with Snapchat and they might not really sure how it works. That can be challenging, or really what the risks are. So there's knowledge gaps there. There's lacks of training. Some of the teachers I spoke to said, well, they are aware, but they had to go and source that themselves. They had to go and find out themselves, get themselves upskilled or trained. And obviously this is an ongoing process because, TikTok, for example, before the lockdowns, I guess it was called Musical.ly, and not many people knew about it. So now it has really grown. So we're thinking, well, what's the next thing? We need to constantly keep ourselves updated on this stuff. I need to constantly keep myself updated on it. So do teachers. So yeah, there was a wee bit of frustration from them that they were having to proactively go themselves to find out information about it.
So does that mean then for teachers there is something of a knowledge or a training gap?
Yes, that's what they were saying in this focus group. Yeah, there was a gap there.
So how could teachers be more empowered? What needs to happen?
Well, I think straightforward information sessions, training sessions, even the fact that some teachers in schools will know how Snapchat and TikTok work, for example, but they won't all. So a lot of it is sharing knowledge and also just being updated. What are the latest trends at the moment? What are these risks? I mean, I think last year there was all this sort of TikTok videos of members of staff, and that was obviously a challenge. There's always something new, isn't there? There's always a new trend or a new influencer that we need to know about. So I don't think it has to be necessarily this huge, a week's training course. I'm thinking, maybe an hour or two once a year will update everybody. Even one or two people in the school, and then they can disseminate that information out to those who need to know, because they are dealing with these issues on a daily basis. That is what I am being told. They can be spending half the morning sorting out an issue that actually happened at 2 a.m. the night before. And these things spill into school and teachers have no choice but to sort it out. But actually, as we know, they're there to teach. And that is being taken away from them because they're spending so long sorting out these issues, often to do with group chats and Snapchat.
I wonder when we ask schools to educate around online safety and so on, I just wonder how easy that is for schools because, my thoughts are, and certainly my experience is, it's not long until we're in very uncomfortable areas for teachers that are not only uncomfortable, but, they're contentious or controversial. You're talking about bullying. Children will disclose things, definitely, and particularly if, as children seem to want, smaller, more intimate groups where they can express their views and so on, they will disclose in those groups. So, you get your bullying They'll talk about blackmail. They'll talk about gambling online. They'll talk about images, inappropriate images that are asked for or sent. They'll talk about sexting and so forth. I just wonder, what needs to happen, or are there gaps, or what needs to happen for teachers to be able to sit down on a Wednesday morning and, allow a kind of free discussion about that, that's, informative, that's educational, and that's of benefit to the pupils that are there?
Sexting is very much a taboo topic. These young people were from different schools, and they were saying it's something either that you just know it's a tick box exercise, that the school's just really talking to us about it because, well, they have to, but they don't really get a chance really to discuss those more sensitive issues. And I can understand that, because there's some teachers maybe who are not really particularly comfortable, maybe, that they're teaching learning for life and work, where perhaps maybe as maybe just a second subject, maybe, and they haven't no training or anything in it. So it can be uncomfortable for teachers, and I can understand that as well.
It'd be scary. It's scary for teachers to,
Yeah.
sit around children like that, because you don't know how, they'll interpret it. Nowadays, we're fairly guaranteed they're definitely going to go home and tell their parents. And, it can be received in a different way there. And tomorrow morning, there could be a plethora of phone calls complaining, what did so-and-so say to my child? He's not allowed to, and this, that, and the other.
It is a challenge, and it's in that, and I know that even within others, again, within my PhD, I was looking at speaking to some people who went to schools and talked with young people, and they were saying that some schools wouldn't be keen on them talking about those sensitive issues because they are worried that parents may not be happy. So, it is challenging as well for schools and for teachers too.
No, the fears of teachers are real.
Yeah, the fears of teachers are real, Paul, and the challenges facing teachers are very real as well. And I know, from this research and from other research that these are very complex issues that teachers are being asked then to deal with. And as you heard in those clips there, these are often issues which have happened in the evening and during the night, and schools have a kind of moral responsibility as well as a legal responsibility to try and untangle these difficult situations. But it takes a lot of time and a lot of effort to try and do so. I mean, this is a reactive, responding to issues. Of course, we would be saying that, that as educators, we need to do more to try and prevent these issues happening in the first place. Education has a really important role here in teaching our children and young people about how they should interact online, and avoiding these situations happening in the first place. But clearly, when they do happen, schools have to deal with them. What we have recommended in this report is a central managed hub, a resource hub for not just children and young people and parents, but also teachers. That was an action that was mentioned in the Northern Ireland Online Safety Strategy. We're endorsing it certainly as a recommendation from this study as well, that teachers and also children and parents, but teachers in this case, need access to up-to-date, relevant and accurate resources to try and help them, because it's just very challenging and time-consuming for individual teachers and individual schools to try and keep themselves up to date on what is a very complex issue. The other matter which came through from our study was just the lack of resources in the Irish language. And we spoke to a couple of Irish medium school teachers, and we also spoke to a focus group of children and young people from an Irish medium school in Northern Ireland here. And clearly there's a need in that growing sector. I mean, the Irish medium sector in Northern Ireland is the fastest growing sector. It's important that we have resources there and training which can be provided in the Irish language. We heard that sometimes you can find a trainer who can provide training in this area. Sometimes you can find somebody who speaks Irish, but finding both together is very difficult. And finding resources and materials to teach children through the medium of Irish is very difficult as well. So there's a need there, a particular need within that sector in Northern Ireland, but teachers need more support than they're currently receiving to help them to do what is a very challenging job in trying to unravel and untangle and support children who have experienced something really sometimes quite unpleasant and nasty online.
Absolutely, they do. Yeah. Noel, I'm still aware that the time's running on, and if you have the time, there are two more key issues we'd like to look at. One we've maybe raised quite a bit already. I know you mentioned there, and that would be parents. And earlier this week, I spoke to two of your researchers about parents and the role they play.
In the report, it talks a little bit about parents and parents' influence, modeling really, or parents' example, them being on their own phones. That's got to be really significant, hasn't it?
Yeah, I think so. And I think that actually the professionals made a very good point that if mum and dad are always sitting scrolling on their phones, the chances are those the children will be growing up thinking, well, that's normal. It's normal to always have your phone nearby. And I suppose to a certain extent we are all guilty of that. That we do use our phones, and we're online. We're online a lot more now than we would have been years ago when you had to access the internet through your laptop or through your computer. So you had to be with that. So I think it is maybe, and it's not to say that we're coming down on parents there, but yeah, I do think parents do also have a role to play as well in modelling that behaviour too.
Deborah, what responsibility do parents bear for their children's online welfare and well-being?
Yeah, it's a real interesting one. And, parents do very often seem really concerned about, they do usually provide them with the devices, they do usually pay for them. There is often a concern with parents that they don't want their child to feel left out. We all know what it was like to feel left out at school or whatever, didn't have the right trainers or whatever it is. But at the same time, we do need to think carefully as parents, is this the right time for my child to have this device or this particular app, etc. Goal to try and engage parents. So whether that was sending information home, whether that was workshops after school or in the evening provided by outside organisations, information evenings, but the challenge is trying to get parents to attend. And I understand that as a parent, we're all busy, we all have 100 things to do in the evening. Sometimes parents maybe think, I'm going to get told off or somebody's going to judge me. But really, I think as parents, the technology is moving so fast. Even if we are au fait with social media and the internet, we still don't know what it's like to access it as a 15-year-old boy or a 13-year-old girl. And parents really need to equip themselves a wee bit better. And understand what those risks are and practical things that we can do to help our children and young people to get the best out of it. To actually, enjoy using the online space, because it's not going anywhere. It's here today, and it will certainly be part of our children. Schools are definitely trying to communicate with parents, but it can be a real challenge to get the parents motivated and available to attend these events and read the information.
Is that a real difficulty that parents don't fully understand the risks and dangers involved?
I think sometimes it is, and lots of parents would maybe say, well, I don't really understand that, I'm a wee bit of a dinosaur. But there's a lot of stuff out there to help. There's a lot of Websites gives us really easy to use information, top tips. There's things that parents can do quite simply. There's parents apps, there's simple things they can do to help them. And, you know, I suppose from my point of view, devices, technology, social media, it is the biggest challenge of this generation. So we can't afford to bury our heads in the sand. We actually need to look up a wee bit and think, right, well, what can I do? What can I do to help my child? Because it's in the interest of their well-being now and in the future.
It's very absorbing listening to Leanne and Deborah there. And one of the things that struck me in the report, it's a line, I'll read it if you don't mind. It says, parents can feel guilty, fearful, powerless, and exasperated, often seeking balance between peer pressure and concerns about what their children are exposed to online. So parents are in a dilemma, aren't they?
Yeah, that's right, Paul. I think I wrote that line. I remember writing that. And the focus group that we had with the parents, there were two, in fact, were very powerful, because there was that tension between a desire to ensure that their children weren't being left out. In other words, that they needed to be online and they needed to have, you know, a phone. They needed to be on the social media accounts with their friends, otherwise they were at risk of being ostracized or alienated. But at the same time, this kind of sense that they were being sucked into a world that they were themselves as parents very uncomfortable with, and they felt powerless. That's where the fear and the guilt really came in there. And so we had parents who felt really very conflicted. They felt that they were, opening this Pandora's box, and they were freely inviting strangers into their home, as it were, as one of the parents said. And that's an area that, to be honest, Paul, I would love to do more research in, because those interviews were very powerful. And I think the parental situation, I'm speaking as a parent here, is a challenging one. There is a need for more training, as Deborah said, and the only thing I would add to that is that the importance of maintaining the relationship with the children and not making this locus of conflict, as someone said, that it doesn't have to be, but clearly a balance needs to be struck between parents and children. And I've lost count of the number of parents who've said to me that they've given up trying to keep their phone off their child at night. They lost control during COVID in some cases, whenever there was nothing else to do, as it were, and many parents, I think, have never regained that control, and that's had very significant consequences, I think, for their children. But what we found, so the focus group of the parents, we had these very concerned, conflicted, guilty, and exasperated parents in the focus groups. But actually, in the survey, what we found was that the children and young people often felt that their parents weren't a bit interested in what they were doing online.
Yes, I read
over
that.
A third.
Yeah.
Over a third of the older cohort and a fifth of the younger ones felt that their parents were not at all interested in what they were doing online. And that's interesting. It's interesting what Deborah was saying there about, parents not necessarily coming along to training sessions either. And that may be partly because they're so busy and parents lead very busy lives, clearly. Or is it because really they're not too bothered about what their children are doing online? Clearly, many of the children and young people feel that they're not bothered, and only a very small percentage of the children and young people felt that their parents were very interested in what they were doing. I mean, it was single figures in some cases. So there is a bit of an issue there for parents. It's challenging for them, but clearly some parents, and particularly of the older young people, aren't that bothered about what their children are doing, and that, and allowing their children to have their phones right through the night. Clearly there's an issue there, and something that needs to be addressed as well.
I used to run evenings for parents, and they reflect very much what Deborah said, and when I would have run them in my own school, you would have got a few parents, and I mean a few, a handful, 5, maybe 8. And generally speaking, they were the parents who didn't need to come. They were doing their best anyhow. We extended that out
Yeah.
to the the area learning community, and that probably involved, it certainly would have been approaching maybe 3,000 children, which would be quite a considerable number of families. And I remember one time organising, quite a significant evening. We had PSNI, we had education advisors, we had staff from each school and experts, and we'd actually one very, very well-known advocate of internet safety and so on. And we got 25 parents, which was, very disappointing, very disheartening for us as teachers. And yet, when things happened online and you meet the parents and they're in my office and they're there with their children and so on, they tell you they're the greatest supporters of, this, that, and the other. There is a dichotomy now.
Yeah, it is. It is difficult. I mean, I'm speaking as a busy parent myself here, and and conscious that I haven't always gone to such events, because things are just are busy. I think probably the only thing that schools can do is to try a range of different approaches, and of course with technology you can do that more easily now than you could 4 or 5 years ago. So whether it's sending a newsletter home, or sending an email, or having a face-to-face event, or an online webinar, there's a much wider range of ways of trying to contact parents today than there would have been a few years ago. And I think maybe schools just need to be a little bit more creative. And just because parents don't turn up to the face-to-face event doesn't necessarily mean that they're not interested. It may be genuinely that they're busy. But I remember speaking at one such event myself a few years ago, and the attendance wasn't fabulous. But I remember one mother coming up to me at the end and saying, well, she was one of these very conflicted parents and that her daughter was in first year post-primary, so year 8 in Northern Ireland. And she was saying that she hadn't bought her daughter a phone. She didn't want to buy her daughter a phone because she didn't want her daughter to be bullied online. But actually what was happening now was, because she didn't have a phone, she was being bullied face to face by the other girls in her class because she was being seen as different. And that for me, exemplifies this tension, this dilemma that parents are faced with, and younger and younger children now having access to really powerful smartphones at a younger age. Then this is definitely challenging. But I think parents can do more. I think there's a balance that needs to be struck. And I think parents ultimately have responsibility for the well-being of their children, and I would argue that allowing young children to have their phones through the night in their bedroom is not in the best interests of the children and young people.
Absolutely agree with you, yes. And yes, you do. You encapsulate that so well, that parents are in a position almost where they cannot win. I do think it helps. It strengthens parents' cases when, maybe the principal of a primary school says to lots of parents, we do not recommend that your child has a phone. It takes out that kind of stigma of one child maybe not having a phone. It certainly lessens it. I don't know if it eradicates it, but at least parents can feel, oh, right, now there's a principal, there's somebody who's saying, I'm right in what I believe, my child should not have a phone. And maybe we need a lot of that kind of joined up kind of thinking, across a wide range of society to help deal with this problem.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that 100%, Paul.
Noel, I know there's one area we haven't talked about, and that is, SEN children. I know you have a particular interest in that. What do we need to know about, SEN children and online safety and so on?
Well, yes, this is an area I'm very interested in, very passionate about. And as part of the research, we carried out 2 focus groups in a local special school. And we spoke to teenagers with severe learning difficulties. And of course, this is a cohort who are often completely overlooked in terms of research And there's often an assumption that children with severe learning difficulties couldn't possibly be online. Well, I can assure you that all of the young people that we spoke to in that school were online in various ways, whether it was playing online games or being on an iPad, or about half of them had their own phones, smartphones as well. So this is a constituency, this is a group of young people who are particularly vulnerable and for whom there are very few resources available. The special school that we were in that day do provide training for their young people, and the young people were very positive about that. They had received very clear safety messages from their school, but the school had to adapt those resources or create them from scratch because there simply isn't anything available for children with severe learning difficulties. Now, of course, you mentioned, SEN, and that term is so broad, and the vast majority of children with special educational needs are, of course, educated in mainstream schools, and there's a huge diversity of need there. But I'm talking particularly here about children with severe learning difficulties who are in special schools, and those who, to be honest, some of the children there would struggle to read or write, but they're still online. They're still interacting with other friends and sometimes strangers in the online world, and they are, of course, particularly vulnerable. And more needs to be done in that space to try and protect them, to try and support them, to try and provide resources for their teachers to help them as well, and simply to acknowledge and accept that these young people are online just as much as their peers. In fact, they want to be like their peers. They want to have social media profiles. Many of them do. They want to have phones. Many of them do. They're often spending many hours online because they enjoy it. But there's a vulnerability there and a need to address that as well, particularly among those children and young people who for too long have been overlooked.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, very true. Noel, I'm very aware that time has completely run away with us. And as is tradition in this show now, I ask a question towards the end of the show. Noel, if you had a magic wand and only one spell cast, what change would you make to education that would significantly improve the lot of teachers?
Well, I mean, that's such a difficult question, but I think to bring it back to what we're talking about really tonight, Paul, is to reinforce and to recalibrate our education system around pastoral needs of our children and young people, and to resist the temptation to focus unduly on attainment and grades. And I'm not saying that those things aren't important. They are important. We want our children to be successful and to have opportunities in the future. But for teachers to be reminded and to remember and have the space and the time to prioritize the emotional health and well-being of the children and young people that they're looking out for and that they're teaching, and to have time and space to prioritize that relationship building, which I think is at the core of what education is all about. Yeah.
No, that wish is an entire show on its own, I can tell you that. And I'd love to do that show with you very, very soon. It's been absolutely fascinating, really absorbing listening to you. I thoroughly enjoyed myself going out and about all week, talking to your colleagues, really enjoyed listening to them and recording to them. Their contributions I thought were fantastic. And I mean, the sense of team and everything from everybody, the knowledge and insight that all of you have, and the great work. It's an absolutely magnificent resource for everyone. As I said at the outset, it's so accessible. It's really invaluable. And there'll be a huge amount go into the show notes. Noel, thank you so much for your time and your contribution, and also to your team.
Thanks, Paul. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I hope that's been useful and interesting for you and the listeners.
Thank you now. Be safe.
You've been listening to Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live and listen back at ttradio.org. We look forward to hearing from you next time on Teachers Talk Radio.